Hello, Tony. You all right?
Hello, hello. Good
Hello.
to.
Well,
I've
good.
heard about you, and good to see you in. Yeah, well, virtually anyway.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Tony, sure you. I've heard of you for a long time, and I've read your latest book, which is here, Black Success: The Surprising Truth. There are a lot of things that interested me in it, and a lot of things I could relate to. And in regards to the title, in a way, you are Black Success from where you were to where you ended up. Um, So shall we start there, like just briefly, your journey from where you are now to like how you ended up here?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a good place to start in terms of how the book is conceived. It's conceived because it's part polemic and part, but biographical.
Mm.
And I think in the end, I couldn't disentangle the two things, the argument I was trying to position and also my own life, particularly the life of my parents. But within there was also, and I suppose I've had this all my life really, a constant antagonism with the prevailing thoughts, of the day. And I find myself constantly in conflict with that. And that's an interesting way to start because I was born in Brixton.
Yeah.
Um, and at the time, my parents had come from Jamaica and they had been part of the so-called Windrush generation. And uh, they came here, my dad came first, my mother came after. And then there was three of us, and I was the oldest. And yes, I think it was very hard because as a child, you kind of still see the world very much as a positive space, and But I was aware that there was very clearly an antagonism to their presence and to the community. However, just what I try and do in the book, and what I try and almost developing, probably you can see it as well, is this positive stance. And it's not because I'm denying the pain or the restrictions, but that in fact that story just hasn't been told, And so what from the start was a kickoff for me was just how close-knit that community was. It was like a little village, but everybody was taking care of each other.
Yeah.
And it was something that you would not see now, and I don't think you'd ever see in terms of everybody was, and it was wonderful. I have to say that I can only describe it as wonderful, particularly the women in that community and how they took care of you, aunties, uncles. Everybody was looking after you, and we didn't know around that because I quickly got the racism, particularly in the 70s. I mean, talk about now, it was so open and raw, and it was rough, and it was tough. And I started the book off in 1981 at the time of the riots. I was actually at university when those big riots happened. That was, I would say, was our kind of civil rights moment in Britain, those 1981 riots, because that shifted the whole thing across. Because I don't think anybody had seen anything like that. Those were the Brixton riots in 1981.
Yeah.
And but you've got to understand that I think this is where it gets complicated, and people don't like complexity, in the sense that even though there was all this going on, the open racism, and at the same time that I said that community was together, I was off to university, and one of the things at that time was only 2% of the poor population went to university. And a very tiny slither of Black people went either. And I did English there as well. It was another unusual subject to do. What happened was the experience was all my fees were paid for, all my living costs were paid for, and I was at an excess amount of money. In fact, I mean, the poorer you were at the time, the way the economics was working, my father was out of work. And so what happened was your local council just gave you this truckload of money. And I was living like a king, at university. And so much so, I tell a story that there were white children who were from private schools who, because they didn't have just marginally enough money, they were actually ended up poor. I ended up lending them money. So this whole notion of white privilege in my head was obviously I got an interest on what I lent them. But you know, this whole idea never came. I mean, it really was for me a different world. Britain giving me the state, the system, almost the poorer you were, the more outside, the more you got. So I was not in this world. And actually, I did not feel in any way at university alienated or any of these things. Were I did a curriculum, we hardly did any Black authors in that curriculum. However, I related to all of those, you know, that scenario. And of course, my lecturers, far from being these white people who were kind of away from me, I ended up in the end actually becoming the executor of some of their wills. Now I'm 60 odd. I've known them for so long that I've been the executor of their wills. I mean, I would go to their house for dinner. I would be, you know, I mean, I would stay because you see, in the end, I didn't really see the world. I saw the world exactly how Bob Marley saw the world, as a place where the color of your skin is just as meaningful as the differences between your eye colors. And I think that was not naive. That was not naive because that was the center of the power. And I think the other bit, because he gave me the confidence.
Yeah.
The other bit, and I'll end here, the other bit in terms of that early kind of framework in Britain was I went to a church, an Anglican church, a very white Anglican. In fact, me, my brother and my sister, we were the only Black kids in that church. So we sat there, and you would have thought, what on earth is going on? My mother sent us to this place because I think she was an Anglican in Jamaica, so she sent us to this church. And that was my saving grace, that church, because in there we joined a middle class enclave. You know, right, that is why is irrelevant to me because it was just a middle class, and so everybody went to university in that, you know, in that area, and we had a great time, and nobody really treated us in any way in terms of race. We joined the Sunday school, and I learned a lot about classical literature from that because the Bible was really important there for me in a sense of understanding it as a text, and also the stories were really important because they were about resilience, and I can talk later about that, about resilience, about virtue, about stoicism. I learned all of that in the Sunday school. And of course, I would end up, I mean, this is where I can't, my world is a bit different. I would end up, my parents didn't even know where I was. I was very young, about 10, going on a holiday with these people, just off to Cornwall for a week. And then we would just go with their family. You know, we jump in the car and just go with it. And you would think, oh, well, were we naive? Did we ignore? Yes, and I think that's important. And I think I argue that I didn't really want them to be experts on racism. They just took me as I am. And later on, that became an issue, maybe. But at the time, that was important because all they did was just see us as the individuals, the humanity that we were. And I believe that. I believe that. They may have had their own things I didn't know about. And I think that was the prep ground for me to do well, compared to, I think, my peers who had a completely different run at this. Yeah.
Yeah. You say there that the story of Black success, especially at your time when you were going to university, is rarely told. Why do you think that is?
Because I think that the ground has been gobbled up by a negative kind of perception of the Black experience in Britain, which suits some people. And I think it suits them particularly now. And you can see that almost with history is a very interesting thing. How, in fact, certain activist groups, certain individuals who may have had a trauma time in that period will refuse to not see the positive run. So, for example, the Windrush I almost hate that term Windrush, because what it means now is all about the scandal. It's all about the Theresa May scandal, where that group, the hostile environment that was created in the 2000s, defines that group. Now, up to that point, prior to that point, nobody even used the term Windrush, really. It was just Caribbean people coming over here. But so what's happened is we go back to that, we shoot back to that history, and nobody talks about the part, the system, the fact that that group, indirectly, because of the racism of the renting prop system, ends up being the greatest home ownership group in the country proportionally. So they own their own homes. They invent their own informal banking system. They have a tight community. And on top of that, via Jamaica, they invent their own music called reggae. I mean, you couldn't get any more. I don't know any community that does all of that stuff, Yeah. Yes, you could argue that the children in particular suffered badly in terms of the education system and things like that. But there was also a group of us that didn't and did very well in it. And so what I'm trying to say is that the stories often, and I picked this up with Mary Seacole as well when I talk about her, how she'd been captured by the left, redefined as this sort of, black kind of nationalist figure, which would have horrified her, And yet, so what's happening is the present issues that people have is defining the past in that negative way, because they want to try and work out their own crisis, and they're not really coming to terms with what really did happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I've read in the book, and also when I've heard you in other interviews, one of the figures you talk about, and I say this in an affectionate way, is your own mother, and you describe her as a black Maggie Thatcher, with that confidence she had, that she exuded around everyone. I imagine that had a massive influence on you, not just on you as well, but I imagine other people around her as well.
Yeah, my mother came, this is where you've got to understand how, and Lenny Henry has a similar mother as well. I've noticed when he describes his mother, very similar. My mother wasn't very big, she's a very tiny woman, but was a storm, was a force of nature. I mean, we moved from Brixton and lived in a Penge, which was sort of 70% white, in terms of the population. And my mother controlled the high street. Everybody had to get their stuff ready for her on a Thursday, and they better. The grocers had to get all their stuff ready. And when she came in, they knew her order, and if they didn't have her order, they would be apologizing. The egg woman, she would have her eggs. The butchers, he had to have the best meat ready, and she just whizzed through that high street and really was almost like a mafia boss, controlled the whole thing. At work, this was another thing that I said, my story is different. My mother cannot call white privilege at work. What happened was that she worked in an electronics factory. They fixed component parts, and she worked in a group. I think there was about 25 white men, and she was the only black woman in her department, in her area. And I felt sorry for the 25 white men, because had they forgotten her birthday or whatever, but she knew all of their birthdays, believe me. And I remember one guy, he'd forgotten my mum's birthday. He came to my house, kind of humble. He said, "Oh, here's the card. I'm sorry, I forgot." Now, my mother wasn't aggressive, but she had that presence. And I asked her one time, I said to her, "Why do you're working in this situation with, first of all, these men?" And then, of course, I didn't mention they were white, but they were white. And she said, "I basically like working with men because I can control them." I mean, that was her thing. And so, and she was running her own kind of informal network of getting her friends and my family into the factory through the back door. So my mother was running her own privilege. So I've never understood this perception or notion of some kind of white privilege kind of conspiracy theory that's going against black people. I'm sure there's some things going on, but that was not my, and of course my mother then when in relation to me, never told me that I had to work twice as hard as a Black person. Never. She never told me that. So that the world looked negative. She never said that. She also said, she never also gave me the so-called talk, as they say. Never had that. All she simply said to me is, Tony, you know what? You're my firstborn, and I reckon you're a genius. And that's it. That's the only thing. And so you imagine you have your mum, you're walking along the road, and every minute she's telling you you're a genius. That's not bad in terms of your own self-perception in the end, you know, because whatever happened, I mean, it's not that it was difficult, but it was, you know, you got the dominant figure in your life. My dad was there as well, but and he was also very positive about me. But my mother just kept telling me this, and that's all she needed to say.
Yeah, I was going to talk about this, literally the talk, because it's something, especially, well, when I was growing up, and even apparently these days, where it seems to start from young, where you've been told the talk, and you have to, work twice as hard and so on and so forth. And I was thought, well, I just want to work hard, just let me work hard and navigate my own, especially as a man in general, because I think men in, well, both men and women, but men in particular, they follow their own journey, and that's how you learn about the world. So I never
Yeah.
understood this whole
Well, see,
talk. So
part of the problem is once you start telling people you have to work twice as hard as white people, is that the world then becomes this closed barrier. You know what I mean? That you're constantly having to. So I arrive at university having to lend these poor rich white kids some cash because so I never had that in my life. And my mother never prepared me for what she prepared me for was my agency and my self-affirmation. That was the thing that she thought was important. She was not naive about racism at all. And she would tell you straight that it exists and it's a reality. Yeah. However, what she was big on was the whole idea that you yourself could do anything you wanted in the world and be anything you wanted. And I didn't think she'd ever think as we walked through the streets of Brixton that I'd end up in the House of Lords, you know. I mean, that would probably be way beyond perception, even though but actually don't know, because she said I was a genius, and she said that you're going to be doing big things. I mean, that's kind of her kind of notion of it. But the fact that they became reality, and the fact that also I was able to then help others make that a reality as well, is an issue. And I do think, you know, that I was thinking about this the other day, that in fact the left and those Black activist groups who have kind of used racism and the racist sort of trope in a sense of kind of put on so many restrictions around their own, actually I don't know if it's around their children, but certainly around young people, that I think that they have become the problem now. They have actually become the problem.
isn't one of the problems as well that they don't see Black people as individuals? And I'll give you a very good example. So I used to write and perform poetry years ago, and then I left for go to reasons. But I went to a poetry night last year, and there was a Black poet, and one of the poems was about immigration. And he said he didn't agree with the government's policy, which is fine, that's his opinion. But then he said, and as people of colour, the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary should know better. Now, I nearly walked out at that point because I'm thinking, well, if you disagree with the policy, fine, but it shouldn't be based on their skin colour. Do you know what I mean? There seems to be this whole imaginary.
Well, you're absolutely right. Let me tell you the thing that really does annoy me. And I saw this, I've seen it recently, where particularly this generation, my daughter's generation, she's nearly 30, they didn't have anything like we went through in the 70s. And this idea that when you do well as a Black person, you have to be doing it in relation to some kind of restriction that the white society has put in front of you. You can't just give a story, a narrative that says, I have just done well because I am good, not because I had to overcome whiteness or whatever. Just tell it as it is. Because my story is that, you know, and I've had to undergo, and I grew up in a time where racism was worse than it is now. And yet I still hear people talking, or they create almost a kind of, oh, well, I did this, and even though there was racism and this and that, and he said, but and when you look at it, it wasn't even race. They're just saying that I had to overcome this. and then that's why I am who I am. And so therefore, as you say, the ground is almost still laid with these little kind of mines, white privilege mines that you've got to, carefully trod through. And then you get to the victory. You can't just run straight through.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that also is something which we've got to say that is rubbish, because, and even if there are restrictions, they're probably to do with your class background, your geography, where you live, if you live in the north compared to London, that, your school that you went to, these may be real your family background. Those may, things that happen in your family. They may be real obstacles. But the idea that systemic, I got here irrespective or through or around the corner of some kind of racist kind of fog, is something which I'm annoyed about when people say that, and it's not true.
yeah. So that leads me on to, I'm not going to get into stats and whatnot, but the whole issue of quotas and DEI and these sorts of things, which personally, and I'll study my opinion, I'm not a fan of at all. Do you think, in a way, this reinforces what you've just said, in that instead of almost looking at why certain people don't get into certain injuries, we just think, oh, okay, we'll put some arbitrary figure on there and hope that so many people from a certain group get in there, instead of actually working out the best route to get to?
Look, people are going to be surprised at what I say here. I actually don't think that having a look and a scrutiny at the diversity and equality and inclusion policies in your workplace is a bad thing.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, this idea of people's surnames often get overlooked, because they haven't got an English surname. There's proof that these things exist. Look, structural things like structural racism, if you want to call it that way, I think these things are a reality. I don't think it'd be naive for me to say that it doesn't. What worries me is that we've reached a point here where we kind of almost kind of be, when it comes, these things become divisive, where in fact, you kind of set on arbitrary kind of institutions or sectors that, in the end, I think they don't help. So, for example, in education, I've noticed lots of schools maybe going for unconscious bias training, things like that, which I don't understand how that will help the situation. And what it does is it avoids the real reasons why certain groups are failing. It may not be anything to do with racist teachers at all. It could be something else. So I do think that the whole DEI thing is problematic in that sense. But I don't think we should overlook the reality of it and do something about it. The other thing, this is more sinister, and I think that I'll be careful what I say here. I wonder whether the whole race industry and the way and the inclusion kind of framework that we have now has actually taken away a lot of Black talent out of, I don't know what job you do normally, but I mean, out of the mainstream workplace. So, for example, a lot of black, particularly women, are going into this world. It's fairly well paid. I wouldn't say that doing this is a waste of time. But I look at their skill set and wonder whether it could have been used differently. And I wonder whether what has happened to many of us is that we've almost seen this as an escape route in terms of work, and not really understanding that there is so much more we can do in terms of our talent base and making that work. I don't know if you've seen that in the workplace. So, for example, those DEI spaces tend to be mainly women, and they tend to, if they're there, they'll have Black people in there as well doing it. But the main core of the business, you don't see so many, I think minorities, or certainly Black people in the main core of the business. And that main core of the business is really where you can rise up And the HR, the DEI space is not really the way in which you can get up inside that business. And I do think we've got to a point now where, you know, what is success? I mean, I know people who are chief equity officers of primarily talented people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But why would you want to be fixing equality? Why not just go and, you know, make something, you know, add something to the Apple phone or something like that. Do something that is, you know, adding real value rather than a preoccupation with trying to match out or kind of expose you know, racism in your workplace or sexism. Is that really a job? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with basically what you said. I will add with DEI, and I think it's getting such a negative rap now, that's almost having a negative effect, because if you get a particular job through that, even if you've worked hard for it, first thing people are going to say is, you only got it because of a quota, it may not be the case, but it's almost
Sure.
been used now as another stick to beat people up with, and I think that's very detrimental.
Yeah, because I think the skill set of those, if you look at those people in the DEI space, they are very talented people, you know. This is what this is really interesting. And I wonder whether there is something in, I mean, people say, oh, if they weren't there, the company or the firm would, you know, wouldn't hire black people, or it would be totally racist. But in a way, I wonder whether that same skill set, if we were to sit it down, could easily be shifted into the mainstream of the organization, you know, and that's where you actually get the mobility, the faster mobility. So I do think there needs to be a review, a big review, and a challenge perhaps to those that are in there. And it's quite. I mean, in the book, I pick up the Nigerian success story in Britain and see that. And to be honest, those Nigerians that came, particularly those who came in the 2000s, and came straight from Nigeria to Britain, went straight into the mainstreams of those banks. A lot of them didn't end up in the DEI space, yeah? And they've done well because they've gone through, because they've been hired for their skill set via that route, you see. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that that's something to think about. I don't want people to think through this podcast that I'm knocking people who work in those industries, because I did say, I qualified this by saying, I do think there is a need for us to look at this. But on the other hand, I wonder whether this is almost a kind of, I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but a kind of way in which black talent is being siphoned away, you know, by creating this. And also what it does is it means there's a massive tick box for your companies. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, we've got X doing all that work over there. You go over the corner, you do all of that stuff. Let's get on with the real job now, because we've got that one sorted. Yeah.
One thing you talked about, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this as well, is the impact of fatherlessness on communities in general, but particularly the black community. Now, just for those who aren't aware, just what is that impact, and how is a fatherless single mother, fatherless?
Let me give you the biggest impact. It leads to prison, it leads to knife crime, it leads to school exclusions. Everybody knows it's the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, and everyone's got lots of excuses around, and everybody knows it's the key driver. Let me give you some numbers on this to make it clear. And you have to then get away from this whole idea that black is a term that you can use for everybody, because it isn't. Mm-hmm. Caribbean numbers on single parents in Britain is running at somewhere in the region of about 65, 66% of it's the highest in the country. Yeah, that made no doubt about that. When it comes to exclusion rates from schools, and when it comes to GCSE outputs, that group outside of Gypsy Roma, and that means they're lower than the white group as well, they're actually performing the worst. If you take the Nigerian group, operating in the same schools, in the similar context, housing context in particular. What they have is single parents homes running at around about 35–40%, which is similar-ish to the white average, yeah? Probably just below that. And yet they run GCSE results nearer the Indian, nearer the Chinese groups, really high figures in terms of that output. I can't think of anything else that's the variable between the Caribbean and, say, for example, the West African group that makes the difference between those results. And then you push up into prison, youth justice figures, and then into prison figures, and you see a similar kind of output going on. So yes, much of our dilemma rests on this fatherlessness issue. Yes.
So how do we solve it? Because it's one thing now about, but how do we turn this around? Or can't we?
Well, I do think that one of the things that makes it, for me, the way in which we can turn it around is I think there's got to be a sense of us really beginning to look at this when children present early in school. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there's a real sense that sometimes when you've got restrictions going on, and so children misbehaving, I saw this in education earlier. Like what we fail to kind of do is really ask the question of where was the family in this story? Yeah, a boy's playing up. Instead, we as a research community, as a collective society, have just gone down this route of let's blame these white teachers who are racist, and let's do training and stuff like that around them, and not come to the core issue of why that boy is playing up. Often the reason is that the father has left the home, or there's some restriction there, and we haven't dealt with that real issue around that boy. Not to do necessarily with the fact that teachers are picking on white boys because they're big, you know. That could be a factor, but it's not, you know, we haven't looked, because I know I've probably done the only research, and a couple of other people, into the other area, the half that hasn't been told. Yeah. And so we just keep sidestepping the issue because it's politically uncomfortable. And people do not want to hear it. What you and I are speaking to now, people will simply put earplugs in and walk away because it doesn't suit the narrative that they want to hear.
Yeah. And that leads me on to Generating Genius, because that was the most fascinating part of the book for me. How, just in layman's terms, how did you manage to turn those schools around in Brixton? Like, what was the process that you and others went through?
Right, now let's get this correct. The only schools that I was part of the process of turning around in a big way, schools, was in Hackney, where we ran a project in Hackney, and there was a process there where we definitely changed the structure of the schools and made them better. Generating Genius is a science project where I deliberately went to the sciences, and it was a project and a program where the sciences were used as a tool to engage young children. First of all, we do it for boys, now we have boys and girls. It was specifically geared towards boys first. And essentially, what I think it was a scaffolding, really, that we provided those young people to have, which actually, in a sense, helped them to sort of elevate themselves and give them the kind of necessary tools and knowledge to do well in the society. So we provided, in practical terms, careers advice. We took them on, we exposed them to top universities. we engaged them with private schools, a whole set of things that we exposed them to that helped them do well. But I think the key thing was we created a club where, in fact, to do well in this club that's where you're going to get your, the status. Whereas in the school, what was happening at the time was, I don't think it's happening now, but at that time, to do badly was to get the status. See what I mean? So we reversed. Yeah. Let me talk about Generating Genius now as a development. It was very much a London Black orientated program. Now we more or less we still do engage in London, but we actually go wider now into kind of the northeast to the south coast, and we're taking on a lot of white children in the program. Mm-hmm. And I think that the reason for doing that is that what we realized was that, in fact, here is this irony about Black success, is that today in 2024, if you're Black and if you go to a London school, the chances are you're going to go to a good university, in inverted commas, and more so than that, your results are much better than anywhere else in the country. So it's actually flipped. Being Black, going to London, and being in one of those top academies, you got the same privilege that I had, in a sense, when I went to university. You are the privileged group. This is the story that hasn't been told. Yet, if you listen to the narrative of the activists, of the left, of The Guardian, you would have thought that these Black children are totally in misery. Yeah? And so what we've had to do, almost as Generating Genius, is flip our vision and say, whoa, here is the irony here. Maybe what it is now is the London story, almost like missionaries. We have to go out now and go after the white children. The white poor children. It's a complete reverse. Yeah. That story hasn't been told.
No, it hasn't been told. And I was going to get into the reverse missionaries and it leads on to what you saw earlier about BAME, this idea that you can't just categorize everyone in the same group, because obviously look what's happened now. You have, say, Afro-Caribbeans on one end, and then, like you say, the Black Africans and other that are doing really well. Even in politics now, I mean, Conservative Party, I think one of the favourites for the next leader of the Conservative Party is originally from Nigeria. So you're right in that it does seem to really show that.
Yeah, I mean, the notion of BAME, which people still are hanging on to those notions that you can pull all people together, but you can't. I mean, the world of a taxi driver in Bradford from a Pakistani background is a world away from a Hindu Indian background doctor in Harrow. The two people couldn't be poles apart, yet they're considered Asian in this big loop. You know what I mean? So we've gone ahead and done some crazy things around race, and we still are living in that kind of a sort of psychotic madness. And I think that one of the things that drives it is guilt, white guilt. I think a lot of that is there. And also some people have some vested interests in keeping this thing going financially.
Yeah. You talked about Mary Seacole before and the perception of her. And it made me think about Black history in general. Now, I'm going to caveat this by saying there's a lot of horrendous stuff that's happened to Black people, and obviously that should never be forgotten and that should be taught. But obviously the title of your book's Black Success. Do we teach about the success of Black people often enough in history, or is that left swept aside?
Well, look, you've got to remember that my title of my book is an ironic title. Yeah. Because even though I'm saying it's Black success, what it's actually saying is it's got nothing to do with being Black.
Yeah.
That's really what the book is driving. All the examples, including myself, in the end, our success has nothing to do with the fact that we were Black. Mary Seacole is a key example of that. Nothing to do with being Black, and that's the whole thing it's predicated. So it's to do with you, your humanity, your agency, your self-affirmation. Those are the drivers of success. So my sense is that I kind of not really that interested in Black history, in inverted commas, in that sense, because so much of it is loaded on victimhood.
Yeah.
So much of it is loaded on not freedom. And one of the things that if you're going to teach Black children about their past and their thing, what you need to do is land it with people who have and movements that have been able to kind of acknowledge and not been afraid to be free. I said that's another thing, you know. So you actually look at examples of people who use their agency. It's not that you deny the reality of racism and slavery and all of these things, but I think that the better way of running at this is to say that these things are a reality. However, at the same time, there's a whole set of, for example, the Windrush story that I said to you before needs to be told in that positive thing. It will now be always told through the lens of the scandal, which only really impacted a tiny amount of people, really. A slither of people were affected by it. Yet it scooped the whole thing. So if anything, what we need to do in terms of history is go over and look again the way in which some of our characters have been almost, we have to clean up, we have to almost decolonize the decolonized, you know, go over again. Because somebody like Mary Seacole captured in 1980, that was when she was thrown in along with Angela Davis and all these other Black kind of power leaders, when in fact, her way of looking at the world was completely different. She should have been really not a nurse, but a business leader. She was an entrepreneur. She was an adventurer. And certainly all the people she helped were white. She hardly did anything. She helped white soldiers who she knew in Jamaica. And she found an opportunity to sell her wares following those soldiers, you know. Also, her color is important. Mary Seacole is kind of mixed, right? But she's mixed, but she's kind of like a quarter Black, if you like, in a sense of, if you want horrible terms like that. But and so in Jamaican terms, well, even now, but certainly then, being associated with Blackness or any, or it would have blown a brain cell, because that was not how the society was set up. You know what I mean? So she would have never, if she knew now, if she was sort of this iconic Black figure, she would have run a mile, you know, because that's not how she was. So what we did was we created the figure for ourselves. You know, we went into history and reconstructed her and made her into a nurse. She should have had a statue outside of the London Business School or something like that, you know, as an entrepreneur. But of course, the left don't like business. They don't like Black people making money. They think money is dirty, you know, even though they have it for themselves. So they position her as a nurse. So there's some noise on this. Can we cut for a minute while I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, can you cut it? Right, I'm just gonna.
Yeah. Okay. So carry on with what you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So my sense is that if we're thinking again about history, we've got to go over those figures and look at them again. Bob Marley is another interesting figure. You know, we may well have missed completely what he was about. For example, if you look at Bob Marley, is perceived as a kind of Black radical who is, especially in terms of Zimbabwe and a Black activist kind of perception, and people perceive him in those terms. If you study the songs, very little is said about Black people. In fact, I think he probably mentions the word Black twice. Mm-hmm. He's not really that interested in necessarily the big politics. In fact, he hates politics. What he's really about is the songs are about an attack on materialism versus spirituality. And he really is. If you go through the songs again, they're all about this very kind of driven world of the fact that the spirituality is the key problem that we have, and that the more we, I mean, he doesn't, material things doesn't matter anymore for him. What matters, justice matters, and justice is driven by the fact that you're more spiritual. Yeah. Now we kind of part that because we think, oh, spiritual is literally airy fairy. We're not interested in that part of it. So we pick up a slither of him and we run with that part of it and we make it bigger than what it really is. And the bit that we don't understand when he talks about all of the stuff is based on that Judeo-Christian framework. That's the tools that he uses. And so it just seems to me that what we've done with him, and he's a big icon, is use him as a kind of political driver for a kind of Pan-African politics. And yet, really, the man isn't really interested. He's certainly interested in racial politics. He doesn't like race. You know, he says race is a problem in itself. And then, of course, he has this massive drive on freeing yourself from mental slavery. So he is really about, dare I say, it's almost Thatcherite. It is drive around you doing it yourself, for yourself. And what people misunderstand is that by going down the spiritual route, Marley is smart. Because what he's saying, he's not saying that spirituality is the opium of the people or something like that, or you're just off in some ganjed haze. What he's actually saying is that is, you then make yourself in the image of God. You then become the image of God. You can't get any more powerful than that. You're God on earth. And that's the power that drives you forward. And then you can do anything. But until you get into that position mentally, yeah, that spiritual position, and that's where the left have taken us somewhere. It's always about politics and about social constructions and things like that. But yet the individual has to be empowered mentally, spiritually, to be God on earth. I mean, you can't, I mean, and so people, what happens is the story of, and this film is out now, One Love, the story of Marley is missed because now we want to have all this kind of paraphernalia around politics. Oh, Bob Marley, Pan-Africanist, whatever. Put me as a nice image on my bedroom wall. Here he is, fierce, anti-European, anti-this, anti-that. When he's not anti-anything, he's pro-spirituality. But you can only get from his position, and I think he's right. And we talked about this whole idea of the mental state that you have to be in. No, you see, this is why we have a problem now. So many of our children now are complaining about, I think, come across this mental, they feel, in a sense, they've got mental health problems. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Lots of them are complaining about it, black and white. And one of the things is because they haven't been empowered, that spiritual drive that you have, that makes you then go through anything and be anything, have the resilience, have the stoicism, have the heroism to be able to take on the world, you know. Marley talks about heroes of creation. You know, I mean, that's like my mom telling me I'm a genius, you know. Yeah. So that's the kind of history that we need to teach our children, not the one that, oh, here are these white people and we need to get reparations from them and they beat us up and they were all of that. Marley's not talking about it. If he does talk about that, his answer is back to this individual going through as spiritually driven. And we don't want to hear that. So we park 90% of Bob Marley and we hear this other piece because we want to hear what we want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, without going too much into history, I understand in terms of mental health and resilience and whatnot, certainly that's helped me in my life. And I don't think it's just black people. I just think in general, like that's being lost.
That's right, it's for everybody. It's for everybody.
That's just being lost, like this resilience where, you know, we have to talk about everything. And don't get me wrong, if there's some situations where it could be so horrific, you do need to let it out. But I just think this, like I say, stoicism and resilience, I say to people all the time that you're going to encounter challenges in life every day, and you need to have that resilience to be able to adapt to those. Otherwise, you're just going to fail in life.
You're absolutely right. One of the things also that's quite interesting is how offended people are. It's very interesting. Even this podcast now, people will listen to it and they will come to it. They won't come to it openly. They'll come to it and they'll be offended. And that's why I love Bob Marley, because in a sense, what some of the offense isn't to do. They're not. It's words or whatever. Because it's not following the track of victimhood. You see. And that one of the great things about and why his songs are so resonate, it wasn't because he was about, yes, he did talk about Zimbabwe and about South Africa and about Black redemption once or twice, but he was really about the fact that you're a hero of creation. I love that. So you can walk through it and be strong and be good and be stoical, and anything can come to you, you can fight. Now, that kind of way of looking at the world, some of the left and some of the social constructivists think that is too much about the individual. You see, they don't like individuals having power. You see, that's dangerous for them. They want to make the world into this social, and what they're saying is that it's all about power in the end. It's white power, and that's what you've got to fight. When in fact, what Marley is saying, and I'm saying to a certain, is that Black success, the surprising truth is that it has nothing to do really with being Black. At the end of the day, it's about your human condition, and that linking, in his case, to a spirituality. In my case, probably similar, but certainly to my parents and certainly to my culture and heritage, which is based on that. It's not based on some performance where I'm running around with kente cloth and something like that. That is fine, but that's not what it's about. It really is about the humanity. And that is what makes perhaps why you see the immigrant, the Nigerian migrant coming in here and doing so well. Because when you live in an all Black country, you're not Black anymore. Just it's zeroed out. You're not Black anymore. So they come out and they say, wait a minute, it's just, what is this Black thing? What the hell? 90% of people look like me. What the hell? And so we're trapped by the whole way in which we've had this Blackness thing constructed for us, and we need to break out of that. And it's hard because people are then feel a sense of a loyalty, a sense of affinity to something that is fairly abstract, and actually, to be honest, at the moment, not very useful.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the offending people, because I've told this story on the podcast before. A few years ago, I went to see a comedian, and during he told a joke about a Black man, which I found very funny. So I'm laughing, and then I'm noticing that all the white faces are looking at me because I almost seem offended, waiting for me to laugh before they can laugh. And I'm like, it's a joke, just get over it. Until then, I didn't really notice, because I'm just here for a good time. And he almost gave me a sense of, for a short while, a bit of power, saying, oh, you're waiting for me to laugh. Okay, then I'm okay. It's a little bit, but this offends, especially offending on another group when you don't even know what they think, or you assume what they think. I think it's just horrendous. Yeah, it's very annoying.
Yeah. What we consider to be cool and kind of, I always find it's quite interesting. Do they, because I'm probably not cool really, but I always wonder, who do some of these activists or these people think are really, to use Bob Marley's term, the heroes of creation? Who do they really think? It's usually somebody from America talking a lot of nonsense about Blackness. That's really what we've plugged into for years. And yet, really, the only person that made any sense was Martin Luther King, because he did, and in the end, even though he said racism was a reality, he like Marley was going for the content of your character as the key driver. That's the cool space to be in at the moment. And I think what we need to do is try and push the narrative away from those people that keep wanting it to be more performances around Blackness, more kind of, this and that. And as you know, it doesn't have any substance. It doesn't take us anywhere. It doesn't give us any skills. It doesn't make us any money. It doesn't put, all it does is it just reinforces victimhood. That's all it does. You know, at the bottom line, it's almost like you get a joy, a kick out of being a victim. You know, and that's it. That's its program. That's its selling point. And I'm saying in my book that I've stripped back, and it's quite a naked place to be, because if you're saying in the end that Black success has very little to do with being Black, then you are really on your own here. You're stripped down, and you're stripped down to sort of then decide, well, okay, this is about my humanity now. You know, this other stuff is really, you know, kind of confected. You know, the racism, though, on the other hand, is a reality, and this is where it gets a bit difficult. You cannot deny, and people will tell you, look, I've been denied this job, or I've been attacked because of the color of my skin, but then that's the reality of the world, and you could be attacked for other things as well, you know, and put down for other things, but that's the reality of the human society that we're in, and so you have to be aware of that. What it shouldn't do is tell you that the world, or Britain in particular, is not open for business for you. That's where it overreaches itself. And so this notion of systemic racism, where everything is completely closed and you're in a well and you can't get out, that is where you have to say, no, you're not going that way. You know, even though the racism exists, it doesn't exist to the extent that it makes me almost impossible to be human. I mean, which is really what it's saying. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Tony, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, because we're coming towards the end. If people want to read your work or what you've researched, where can I go to?
Well, I think that the best thing to do is Black Success, you know, The Surprising Truth is the title. I think that I have a LinkedIn thing which you can just jump on and maybe talk there. I don't want people on all over my personal stuff, but you know, I'm sure people can write in on that on the LinkedIn page, and you know, drop their remarks there if they want to, you know. But overall, I think the best thing is just buy the book, you know, and you can get it on Amazon. Yeah.
Well, I'll leave a link to the book on Amazon in the description below.
Sure.
Dr. Tony Sewell, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on to 286 Project.
Thank you.
Thank you.